Okay, so I would like to welcome everybody to our first PRISM seminar for the spring semester. And just one piece of housekeeping before we get started, which is for this talk, I think the way that we'd like to handle Q&A is, rather than unmuting yourself to ask a question, just either hold your questions until the end where we'll have a Q&A period, or type them in the chat. And that way the speaker can have a choice of the most convenient time to answer those questions. So with that, it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Laura Norén. She's going to talk about COVID tracking as a prism for refracting tech ethics. And just to give you a little bit of background information about Dr. Norén, Dr. Norén is a VP of Privacy and Trust at Obsidian Security, a cybersecurity startup based in Newport Beach, where she runs privacy operations and nurtures a culture of capable data guardianship. Dr. Norén is a frequent speaker on data ethics, privacy legislation, and the social impact of data-driven technologies. She continues to publish in academic journals and also in the popular press. She holds undergraduate degrees from MIT and a PhD from NYU, where she completed a Moore Sloan postdoc at the Center for Data Science. So with that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Norén, and we're really looking forward to your talk. Thanks.
Thanks, Ravi. Hello, all the familiar faces. It's cool to be back. So I do work in the private sector now, but I was in academia for a long time before that. There's all my bona fides, and we'll just keep going because I think most of you already kind of know who I am. But I do care a lot about tech ethics, and the reason I went to the private sector for a variety of reasons, but one of them is that I wanted to know what tech ethics looks like in real live organizations where these decisions have to be made all the time. So that to some degree does inform some of the way that I frame this talk. But basically what this is probably a little different than most of the other seminars in this series. Is kind of a teachable case study that looks at COVID. So I'm happy to share these slides afterwards, and if you want to use them in your own classes, that would be fantastic, or because it's such a familiar case study to most of the students you're going to have. I don't think you'd find too many that don't know this case. You probably could slice off little pieces here and there and use it as in modular ways, which is kind of nice. It does take a little bit of time to get through it. You could see how it could be workshopped if you had slightly longer than an hour. So this is kind of where I start. The case is COVID. The virus here is an amoral actor. It's successful, it kills people. So it also is a pretty potent actor in this system. And that's kind of nice as a case study because it focuses attention on the socio-technical system that's designed to address the problem, not on the virus itself. So a lot of times I think some of these ethics case studies, you get caught up in like, well, we should blame whatever's the bad actor in the system, which may be true, but in this case, this kind of avoids that because you could certainly blame the virus, but it's amoral and blaming it's not going to really get you that far. So I like that a lot. And it really focuses on where the action space is. So to frame this out, the stakeholders here, I like to do a stakeholder analysis with students. Would be different nation states, which gets really interesting if you wanted to take different nation states as your cases rather than the cases that I took, which are 2 different interventions within the US. We also have major institutions involved, industries big and small. That's clearly been part of the public discourse. In this case, I think probably everyone in this channel can agree that the US has done rather poorly in the face of this challenge. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the approach has been unethical. So it's also a nice kind of moment to talk about the difference between failure and being unethical, because they're not the same. Keep going with stakeholders. These are smaller stakeholders, employees, families, individuals. They also come up a lot, especially in the way that the US frames the discourse on what to do about COVID and where interventions are possible. It tends to be a very individualistic society. Individual rights matter a lot here. So of course, this is an imperfect list of stakeholders, but this is kind of, these are the necessaries. If you've missed some of these, probably go back and look again and getting some granularity in groups like employees, the difference between features and tech workers. There's a difference between wait staff or cooks and, well, me, for instance, academics. So I think the COVID 101, how much do you have to present about COVID to make this work? Well, basically, the less people breathe the exhalations of other people, the safer they are. So the interventions have all looked at kind of keeping people apart, making them wear masks, reducing their time spent physically together, testing, tracking, and isolating people who test positive. Doing all of those things can harm the institutions and individuals. So what is the upshot here? Kind of the problem is humans are evolved to be social, and all of our institutions have sort of been crafted around that, that strength that humans have to be social and to organize socially. Um, so the fundamental protection strategy that we're approaching here, which is isolation, is profoundly difficult because it's really challenging for the way that almost everything is set up, including our own evolved social beings. So what's at stake? Usually I would let students answer this, but I've done this before and it takes a long time. So I'm just going to skip it. Obviously, people might die. So that's pretty big stakes, pretty high stakes. Morbidity is probably a more likely outcome, though it's maybe somewhat less severe. Depends on how you feel about the morbidity challenges. Personal freedom comes up a lot in these conversations. Family finances, business finances for politicians. Getting reelected has been a real interesting component to the way this has unfolded in countries that are undergoing elections during this time. Public health, community fabric, rituals and religion. I was living in Southern California where religion played a really big role in how the mask mandates rolled out or didn't roll out. States' rights, federal authority, sacrificing key experiences. What if you don't get to graduate in person? I'm sure your students are concerned about that. We know we all want to spend more time in Yankee Stadium. Personal social networks, mental health, intact families. You could go on and on. This is usually a fun time to get students involved because there's kind of no wrong answers here and lots of right answers. This could be larger. So many institutions in the face of all this have asked themselves, how can we protect each other, our lives, our livelihoods, and the good that makes up the way of life that we have? Okay, that's probably the right way to frame this. So many institution strategies, be an apostrophe there, were kind of along the lines of, well, we've got a good thing going. We should probably keep it going with whatever the most minimal interventions might be. This is typical for organizational inertia. Change is hard. Change usually costs money. Change feels uncomfortable. It's usually reduced. So again, this is a good case study for that reason because it's normal. The responses have been somewhat normal. So the tactics, that's where we get into the actual case here. So what does it mean to do a minimal intervention? What activities should not actually happen? And who among us are the most vulnerable? Now that last question sometimes makes it to the table and sometimes just, I like it when it does, but you know, always with the nice things. So one of the solutions that is most applicable to my way of looking at the world right now from where I sit is COVID tracking apps. Clearly, I'm not alone here. There are more than 100 of these contact tracing apps. They have different bells and whistles. Some of them are really only contact tracing. Some of them allow people to input test results, to order tests, to make appointments for vaccines, for instance, although not here yet. But for the most part, they keep logs of people who have tested positive within a community in one way or another. All the people that anyone in that community has been around may be notified that they could be at advanced risk. Now, some of these apps would then sort of have an ecosystem around them where they can force a quarantine, and some don't, and they just sort of provide information that seems highly consequential with very little else. Like, okay, now what am I supposed to do with this information? Has happened. So there's a lot of ethical questions around whether or not that type of sort of information without any kind of ancillary support is really moving the needle on ethics, or if it could have some unintended consequences that are quite negative, in fact. So one might want to stop at that point. But this is kind of how I spelled this out. So this is a real state. I renamed it with a fake name, Western state. So in the spring, a Western state with very few cases and a largely rural population, as well as a strong aversion to state intervention, decided they would not ever have a mask mandate, nor would they shut down anything. You just don't need to. They're naturally isolated due to that rural population, and they're just rugged, and it's going to be fine. One of the residents of this state happened to be a senior engineer at Microsoft who had built an app that was sort of already a contact tracing app. It looked, he was really interested in watching Western State football. But Western State football, while very popular in Western State, wasn't so popular outside of Western State. So whenever the team traveled, he wanted to know which bars are people congregating at, so I can go watch the game and drink beers with other people who support Western State football. So I kind of admit this is a somewhat ingenious reconfiguration of an existing app to do a new thing. I am not opposed to this. I think it's kind of creative and fun. So anyways, he's like, okay, I'll donate my app to the state and do all the engineering work behind the scenes to make this work at scale. Now, luckily, the state has fewer than 1 million people, so scale wasn't super huge. And the way that he had set it up originally was to just send all the location data for this tracing app back to Foursquare. And Foursquare, as you may or may not know, is a commercial entity that used to be a social network, but now is basically a location resolver. So if you send it that long, it'll send you back, okay, Muji is at this location, Cafe Lafayette is at this location. And it's really, it's better than just a block level resolver. It resolved to the actual business or frat party. It's actually more powerful than just businesses. So it's very popular for use in those kinds of things. And I think the idea was you can at least track where people are being exposed, and you can tell those businesses, hey, you've had a lot of cases, you may need to take action here. And so the state didn't really have to spend too much money on this, and the app was optional, as most, well, it varies somewhat. Some apps are in fact optional and some are not. So case number 2 is probably much more familiar to everyone on this call, is residential university. So in the spring of 2020, when most universities were trying to figure out what the heck the right response would be for the fall, residential U decided to give students a choice. You can either come back and go to classes in person, or you can stay wherever you are and learn remotely. This was a residential university, so they had things like dorms. It was also pretty big, so they had a medical school, they had science labs, they had a hospital, they had public health experts. So they were really well resourced to come up with a more systematic approach to keeping people safe on campus. Furthermore, everyone in this situation had health insurance, so or at least most everyone did. So there was a lot of resources going on here. And a core part of this decision was, okay, if you're going to agree to come back on campus and do things in person, you must use this contact tracing app, you must take tests, you must submit those test results to the app, and we're going to monitor everything that way. And you don't use this, then you're not really welcome to come back to campus, period, end of story. So at this point, I think it's important to just pause and think about which are the ethical principles that define the key differences between these approaches. There are key logistical differences, and then there are key ethical differences. And the beauty of this case is that it's really complicated. So normally we think of consent as an ethical good, but in this case, the consent to the app is not optional for residential university. You must use it, and the consent to the app in Western State is completely optional. So from that perspective, if you're putting, human choice as your utmost ethical principle, Western State is looking a lot better. I mean, sure, residential U gave people the choice to come back or not, but you could easily argue that that's not really an even choice, right? If what you're paying for as a student is the college experience, not getting it is a pretty big sacrifice. So being forced into this app is kind of coercive. It's not just a free choice. So that's kind of an interesting debate. And it's really complex because usually, and I now work on the operations side of privacy, and I can tell you a lot of privacy law rests on this idea that informed consent is a really good way to govern what people do with their data. No, I tend to disagree with that, um, but that is just a key question to bring up, and it's really complex in this case. Okay, so what are some of the ethical principles? You probably are going to get things like this. There's freedom consent, there's tragedy and triumph of the commons. Sneeze, no, fake, false alarm. Privacy threats, especially related to health information. This seems to probably be more likely to come up again if you wanted to add vaccine mandates to this case study. That would work really well. We don't really know exactly how that's going to play out yet. And it looks like every institution is going to have to come up with their own ethical assessment of whether or not they can require vaccines. Must require, can require, should not require. Be interesting to see where people land on that. Differential sacrifice and protection. It'd be great if students came up with that, and some of them very much will, but who gets left out? It's an important question. And there's also questions about apps being insufficient, right? Like if you're resolving back to bars and fraternities, and you're sending those bars and fraternities and whatever else notifications that they've had outbreaks, is that actually sufficient? Is this tech washing where you look like you're intervening, but you're in fact doing very little and taking all the attention and resources away? It's kind of hard to argue that in the case of Western states, since the app was provided for free and didn't really under-resource anything else. Those are all kinds of things that could come up. From a data science perspective, there was a lot of noise and many presentations on this question of like, oh my goodness, are we in our attempt to solve COVID problems just degrading people's privacy in ridiculous ways? As it turns out, it is technically possible to design COVID tracing apps so that they either use location data, like sending lat long over the course of someone's day, into some central data store and holding it for, I don't know, say 14 days would be reasonable in this case. Or you could use device IDs. You never actually get people's location, and you just send matching device IDs. Were you ever near this other device? We don't actually know where you were when you were near this other device. We just know that you were close. These two devices were close, and we assume that this being the land of the phones, you're never that far away from your phone. So if your phones were close, you were close. Therefore, that was the contact. So Western States contact tracing app relies on this lat long resolution. Residential use does not in this case. This came up as an ethics question. I was rather frustrated by it because I felt like it took the conversation away from where the real ethics questions are. But it is nonetheless an important conversation because this kind of thing comes up a lot in data ethics. So let's just pause on the difficulty of location for a second. So location is in fact a digital fingerprint. It can be resolved to individuals. This often creates anxiety among privacy professionals, possibly not among anyone else, but those are my people. So I'm well aware of this anxiety. In this case, the Western state used the lat long, the residential university used device IDs. And the argument usually from the privacy department, when they're concerned about not just privacy law, but the actual ethics underpinning this consideration, is that where people go to work, go home, go to their third places, which they probably don't do anymore, is like a digital fingerprint. Almost nobody else actually goes from the same home place to the same workplace to the same third places. Even in the COVID times where we don't have any third places, it's still true that almost nobody else goes from the same home place to the same workplace. So that lat long data is in fact a digital fingerprint. And the argument, but you're like, yeah, but a device ID is also a pretty decent digital fingerprint. It may be attached to your phone, but it's a pretty damn good identifier. Why are these different? And the difference kind of comes down to you can replace your phone. I mean, it's somewhat onerous, but it is possible to replace your phone, um, get a different device ID, or replace your laptop, or whatever it is that the device ID is being taken from. It's not that easy to replace, say, your workplace or your home place and get a different digital fingerprint. So this is a nice kind of case study on which types of identifiers are more and less ethical to use. And device IDs come up all the time in data science issues. You need something to do record linkage, which are more ethical. So I like it for that reason. So this case brings that up because this is kind of a durable conversation about what's more ethical to do. And the basic takeaway is if the person really can't change the underlying identifier very easily, if it's their face, if it's their some other biometric, if it's their location, then you really better have a darn good reason to use that as opposed to something else. And forcing this issue on this particular tracking app, um, COVID tracing app conversation was like, oh, well, there is a technical way to do this differently. Let's do that. Most of the newer apps in which these concerns have been raised are using device ID handshakes rather than location data. So I like it for that reason, but I also feel like, yeah, in this particular case, it's a bit of a distracting ethics question. So in the end, what happened? How did this play out? We have enough data now to kind of know. So in this hypothetical residential U, in fact, everyone on campus was forced to use the app. They were forced to get tested. When students tested positive, they had to go quarantine, but they were actually offered spaces in which to quarantine. And they were then still allowed to attend Zoom school if they were well enough to do so. Their contacts, there was enough resource there to quarantine those folks too. And it wasn't perfect. Some people got sick, but the positivity rate was never above 3%. So, okay. I mean, to me, that seems like a reasonable outcome. Other people may feel like, no, it should have really been 0% or you don't have success, but this is not, ethics is probably not a terrain for perfectionists. In Western State, the app was not widely used. So this thing got created and it was supposed to be just for Western State, but it wasn't widely used. There was also never a mask mandate. And this is true, so you can probably figure out which state this was. 13% of the state has at one point had a positive test for COVID. That's probably an undercount because probably not everyone who had it got tested, but that test rate is the highest case rate in the US at this point. So things went abysmally wrong in Western State, in my estimation. Now, people in Western State may feel like that's reasonable, that not as many people died. So this was a reasonable outcome. It does bring up a very interesting conversation about what conditions need to exist before you can justify removing personal freedoms. And it would be fantastic to have someone from Western State debate someone from residential U at the governance level to see where they fall out on that. I don't have that data, but that would be excellent, because I'm sure that this is more complicated than I'm making it sound, but those are the real numbers. So what I then like to do with students is to point out that technical interventions do matter. Look at with this ecosystem approach, but also the app was really important at residential U. You stick with a positivity rate that never is above 3%. Obviously masks might be the technical intervention we all need more than apps. But in any case, the technical interventions at residential U really did work. So sometimes I have certainly gotten questions from people who are in my audiences who are just like, why do you keep bringing up this ethics stuff? Because it just makes tech look bad. And in fact, tech is good. And maybe if we just stop bringing this up, journalists love this kind of stuff. Maybe we don't need to be so public about these conversations, because it just makes tech look bad. And that's going to be a net negative. You're not going to get the good interventions. You're going to get mired in long discussions that have no clear conclusion. This is just a waste of time and it is a net bad. So in this case, technical interventions do matter. They can be for the good. this can be a great force multiplier. So not all data ethics are conversations about what not to do or why things are unfair or horrible. Um, from an ethics discussion, this is kind of where I like to go with this. And, depending on how much you want to get into ethics, you could have entire lectures on these issues or just touch upon them briefly. So the kind of key frameworks and the discussions that are embedded here that I like to get into. So like I alluded to before, this conversation about choice, consent, and freedom, especially in the US context, any ethics conversation usually has strong elements of choice, consent, and freedom being levers that you can kind of adjust to make things more or less ethical. And in fact, most of the law that we currently have that looks at data privacy, not so much data security, rests on individuals' ability to consent or rescind consent freely. So lots of the CCPA, Washington, many more states are considering privacy legislation. Almost all of it rests on the idea that an individual person should be able to be informed of what's going to be happening with their data before those things happen, and then in some ways rescind consent for that kind of activity. If anyone who's operating at scale knows that this is a very complicated kind of strategy to run at scale. And if you've read any of the literature, you know that people don't actually read privacy policies or EULAs or any kind of click wrap, anything. So the idea that they're making a legitimately informed consent is not supported by the data, which makes those procedures rather ethically shallow. I can say I run privacy ops for a company now. We definitely deal in personal data. We try to do it as ethically as possible, but almost like I would say maybe 0.1% of what is meaningful about what we do comes from individuals coming to us and saying, hey, what are you doing with my personal data? Can I ask you to stop doing this? Can I see what you've done? We get none of those requests. But everything we do that I would kind of count in the like, yay, we're doing it right category is based on some other kind of procedure. However, the vast majority of discourse on this topic revolves around choice, consent, and freedom. Who's free to do this? Who, can with transparency help us here? That's also part of this. You can't really consent if things are not transparent. But this case does a nice job of at least demonstrating why those things are complicated. In the Western state case, there was maximal choice. You could choose to use this app or not use this app. You could choose to wear a mask or not wear a mask. You could choose to get tested or not get tested. You could, be maximal choice, which usually is presented as a more ethical strategy, and yet the outcomes were much worse. We happily debate this at some greater length, but I'll leave that for the Q&A section. But I do like to waive this is such a perfect case for just pointing out how distracting and often impoverished conversation about choice, consent, and freedom makes these kinds of decisions about tech ethics and how to intervene. They always need to be at the table, these issues, but they shouldn't be the only three elements at the table. If you add transparency, it's still the same table. I think a lot of us are capable of at least describing this as an interesting application of the tragedy of the commons. So maybe not in these two edge cases, but in the kind of more middle ground case where lots of people, but not all the people, would subscribe to a contact tracing app. They're kind of a complex illustration of the tragedy, and to some degree, the tragedy of the commons, and to some degree, the triumph of consenting to being governed. So the typical tragedy of the commons is a situation where an individual is incentivized to overuse collective resources, which in the long run will degrade those resources so that they're useful to no one. You could argue that the short-term overuse of freedom from masks and social distancing and isolation harms many people in the long run, everyone in the long run. But it may benefit certain individuals or businesses in the short run, or maybe for longer periods of time. So residential U did not have freedom from any of these things. Masks were mandated, the app was mandated, quarantine was mandated if it came to that. And the outcomes were much more positive. So this is a fascinating application because, you know, everyone here had to use this, and the consent to being governed was really kind of the winning strategy. And it's interesting to see that this was effective at the level of an institution like a university and completely ineffective at the level of most states. And certainly it wasn't even attempted at the level of the US national government. So it's interesting really quickly because the way out, the practical way out of a tragedy of the commons usually is a consent to be governed. And that implies that you're going to need to have an effective source of good governance, which quickly gets into a political conversation about what effective governance looks like, which may or may not be something you want to tackle in your classes, but if you're looking at real world applications, it does really matter. So to expand on that a little bit, the residential U success really was resting on three key elements. It had a fair amount of resources. So if you know that you should quarantine someone, but you don't have anywhere for them to quarantine, you're in trouble. If you know you should test people, but you don't have enough testing capacity, you're in trouble. Residential university had a lot of resources, so that was fantastic. It also had a lot of capacity, a lot of buy-in from stakeholders. So capacity to govern was there, and the technical application of the app went pretty well. It did not fail. So those three elements were great. Probably the app did not fail in the Western state case, though no one used it, so it's hard to say if it would have scaled properly. But the other elements were somewhat lacking. The resources were not there. They didn't. Most states don't have the capacity to offer safe quarantine locations. Adequate testing is still not available. So those elements and the consent to being governed in a more top-down way is probably not real prevalent in Western state or Western states in general. One conversation that I would say is somewhat woefully lacking in the way that I presented this case, but could be usefully added, and I would normally include in an ethics case study, is looking at the overall distribution of harms and benefits, which was here, and then also looking at the differential distribution of harms and benefits. So this is sort of drawing on a kind of Rawlsian. You're going to design a governance system. That governance system better be able to look at where the differentials and harms and benefits, like you have an equitable distribution of benefits. Is it hitting everyone equal, or all the goods that are coming out of this available to everyone evenly, and are the harms being distributed pretty evenly? Are they falling all on one group? So in the COVID case, I think we can all see that lots of people have benefited from some of these interventions, and maybe healthcare workers have really borne the brunt of a lot of the harms, in terms of overwork, in terms of having a higher likelihood of catching COVID. You could see that. So that would easily be inserted into this case. There's many, many other ways to do that. I was just reading before I came into this call that academic mothers have really dropped off in their ability to produce research and get grants during COVID in a way that academic fathers and non-mothers have not. So there's a lot of different ways to slice this one. But that wasn't really part of the case study. I typically always include this because why? I have found that in conversations like this, a lot of technical people really, really, really love utilitarian ethics. They love the idea that you can somehow attribute a numerical value or some perceived, I don't know, economic value to a harm or to a benefit, and then multiply it out over however many people are in the system and be like, well, it is net good, or it is net better than it would have been. And I have occasionally made those types of arguments myself, like, should we have self-driving cars? What if they sometimes kill people? Yeah, well, compare it to, like, what if we kill 40,000 people a year driving around without self-driving cars. So if this is net safer, it's probably something worth considering from that perspective. That particular approach, very, very, very popular because it fits with kind of strategy of computational thinking that many technical people are very familiar with and comfortable with. However, that can tend to lead to a situation where, like, let's say you only have a 1% false positive rate, but those false positives are always the same type of person. Well, then you still haven't designed an ethical system. You may have designed one that is net beneficial, but it's failing on fairness. And so I would normally include that, but I didn't here because it turns out in these, if you take the two edge cases, everyone in Western State had pretty negative outcomes because they had such a negative outcome. And I don't have enough information about the residential U case to know if their negative outcomes were more disproportionately impacting certain groups. Don't know. You could layer on the academic mothers paid a higher price. That was what was happening. So the key takeaways that I'm, just to summarize what I think is important about this case and what is nice about this case is that freedom, choice, and consent are always critical components of ethical design, but they aren't uncomplicated goods. But just giving people choice and it doesn't always mean that that is in fact a good thing to do, nor does it always lead to good outcomes. Taking away freedom tends to be more easily understood as a negative, but in this case, that consent to be governed was really, really important to success. So this is a nice case for complicating kind of the knee-jerk response to a lot of actual, tech ops in practice or tech ethics in practice. Like that last point, collective benefits and harms, as well as differential benefits and harms, must be considered. And it's often difficult if you're trying to design a system to know what those differential benefits are going to be. So it takes a fair amount of creative thinking to get there. And because of creative thinking, because you probably don't have a lot of data at the beginning to support that, and you're probably talking to people who really are data driven, it can be difficult to convince anyone to think of it that way. Think about those differential benefits and differential harms and actually intervene upon them before they happen. That's my experience. So collecting data that offers no benefits to individuals is ethically dubious. In the case of residential U, almost everyone was going to benefit if this intervention was applied. It's probably true that in Western state, there was a reasonable assumption among people that if not everyone uses this thing, maybe individuals are uncomfortable sending in that kind of data about where they're going because it's, they find it to be of dubious value and potentially ethically questionable. There's a fair amount of skepticism about data-driven projects and location tracking. So that's going to have real implications on how much you can get your system adopted. Probably the biggest takeaway is this is technical interventions don't happen in vacuums. The COVID case is the perfect example of that. Had you tried to force people into the same exact contact tracing app, the same exact technical intervention that residential U had, but you didn't have the capacity to really offer them much testing. So let's say they have to pay out of pocket every time they get tested. They'd have to pay out of their own pocket to try to find somewhere to quarantine. You'd have gotten a much different adoption rate and success rate. So the technical intervention alone, even if it is very well done and very well intended, if it is not embedded in an ecosystem of the appropriate kinds of support, it's not going to succeed. This is a nice case to explain to people, make very clear to students and maybe sometimes ourselves. So no matter how good our intentions and how great this, the technical intervention, if it's not properly embedded, it's doomed to many other problems than it would have had if it were properly embedded. And the last kind of reminder on the location data piece, but that applies also to biometric data. Anything that identifies people based on characteristics that can't be changed is probably, especially if it's attached to something that could stigmatize or harm them. For instance, as we evolve this into vaccine tracking, we really have to be careful about how we deal with this kind of identification. I think it's probably we're going to find another, well, there's a net benefit to having really accurate records and really clear understandings of who is and who isn't vaccinated and with which vaccines and at which time points they got vaccinated. It's really good to have accurate data and to really be able to attach it to a person. But if that information is then going to be used to discriminate, make discriminating choices about who's going to be employed or who's going to be allowed back to offices and who isn't, it's got to be really, really sensitively handled. Sadly, there's a pretty strong anti-vax sentiment, and that particular sentiment seems to be more prevalent in certain communities than others. So it's going to be a difficult way to make interventions, but I don't see a way for that to succeed without technical components to the intervention. Otherwise, it just doesn't scale very well. And that is pretty much all I had. So I was successful in leaving some time for Q&A. And I will stop talking and ask Robbie if he's been paying attention to the chat. I haven't been.
Well, first off, let's thank Dr. Norén for her great presentation. Clap. Never the same as if we were all in person, but it looks like there actually weren't any questions in the chat. I'm imagining that folks were just holding off until the Q&A session. So I'd like to open it up. You can feel free to ask questions in the chat or just unmute yourself and ask Dr. Norén directly. And I'd also, as usual, like to particularly encourage students to ask, feel free to ask questions. So anybody?
Okay, I'll ask a dumb question because, someone's got to. So to what extent can we learn from, I know it's not the same, but the regulations currently around kids getting vaccinated for school and camp and all those things. Like, so if you're going to public school, you have to get vaccinated. If you're going to private school, I imagine the vast majority of private schools, I guess if you're not gonna, one reason people homeschool is so that they don't have to vaccinate. Does anyone feel at this stage that that's unethical? Can we learn anything from that? Or is it so different because we already have herd immunity and all those things that it's like, it's such a different world?
I mean, there's definitely lessons to be learned in terms of how people perceive those kinds of mandates. And, I think most people find them to be quite reasonable, but there is a significant percentage of the population that feels that their individual freedoms are being harmed by those interventions or by those mandates that their kids must be, vaccinated against measles, which I think there's even evidence that, yeah, if you don't vaccinate, your kids will get, have a higher risk of getting measles. So it's not uncomplicated, and it's a good example. And I think because the COVID vaccine is newer and is less tested, the opposition to it is much stronger and deeper. And as far as I can tell from my cursory examination of who it is that's opposing the COVID vaccines, it's a lot of communities of color. A lot of people who maybe have had less access to formal education themselves. So if the intervention is like, well, yeah, vaccine mandates have worked, you generally don't worry that your kid's going to get measles when you send them to school because there are these elements in place. We'd like it that we can also assume our kids aren't going to get COVID or our teachers aren't going to get COVID. So we should do the same thing. I think the numbers are going to be pretty different at the outset if the mandates go into effect right away. there is something to learn. It's just that the scale of the opposition on the COVID front is much bigger than the scale of the opposition. And for reasons that I am not even going to speculate why anyone would do this. But in the past, with the measles anti-vaxxer sentiment, the doctor who was really kind of at the, well, he's not a doctor anymore because his license has been revoked, but at the time he was a doctor, when he started receiving all the negative attention, he sort of doubled down on his messaging and he targeted the Somali community and Somali refugees in the US, and it was pretty effective. I don't think that I see no reason to expect anything different with the anti-vax COVID. It will find a place where the message is more likely to stick, and it will stick. So I think we do really need to be pretty sensitive about how this is working. It's very easy for probably everyone on this call who's fairly well educated to just be like, well, this is a no-brainer. You have to mandate these. That's one of the ways to get uptick. That's one of the ways to prevent, new mutations from becoming even more devastating than the current mutations. No brainer, but it's going to be really difficult. And yeah, and that's that you get right back into this really complicated conversation about what is the role of freedom, choice, and consent, which are often placed at the very, very, very top of any kind of ethics conversation in the US. This is not necessarily the case in other places, but here those are really treated always as uncomplicated virtues. So yes, there's something to learn. Yes, it's going to be harder. Obviously, the science isn't going to change. Yeah.
So it looks like we have two hands raised, and I apologize, I didn't see the order that the hands were raised, but I figure we probably have enough time to do both. So I'm just going to go with Pat and then Kyle afterwards. But again, apologies if I got the order wrong.
All right, well, thank you. So I'm wondering if you, and very interesting talk, thank you for this. Informed consent, I'm on the IRB at NYU, and we obsess about having all the different pieces laid out and make sure that people understand, and it's often hard to do. But, but then I go back to my office and I get some new program that I want, and there's, 8 pages of small print, and it's not a matter of choosing one or the other. And if I need to use that program, I just say yes, and I know I shouldn't. Can you tell us what kinds of efforts are being made to actually make it possible for people to do something like process what they're giving up, and being able to give up part of the bundle, but not all of it? It's so often it's all or nothing. You can leave the university, or you can take these, agree to 18 different things. But how are people talking about how to actually make this more meaningful?
That's an excellent question. I guess one nice thing about the COVID case is that it did force a consideration of, well, if you don't consent to living on campus in the way that we're going to ask you to live on campus, which is your life is controlled a little bit by this app and when you last got tested, well, now there's another way. You don't have to go to campus. You can still access classes. You can access most of what the library has to offer. You can access a lot of things now that you couldn't before. So sometimes these forcing functions, like, well, what if someone didn't want to consent? Could we come up with something that's better than a binary? You either get everything or you get nothing. You either get to use this software or you get nothing. And most, like I didn't write this. There's an entire wonderful book on what makes informed consent legitimate, and pretty much none of the legal documents that we consent to when we click wrap agreements would be considered legitimate consent. If you didn't read it, you don't know it, you're not informed, therefore your consent is not legitimate now. That's like a very academic perspective. Legally, I don't think anyone's ever challenged them quite on that level. So yeah, they're legally legitimate, but from an ethics perspective, most of the things we consent to in the way that you just described would be considered illegitimate consent. So how would you make it so that it's actually more legitimate? You're absolutely correct that a lot of what I find most frustrating about what I do is that almost everything I do somehow gets thrown into a conversation about privacy, and almost nothing in this conversation. Like there was one little bit where you're talking about location data and whether or not that might be too privacy revealing. That was the only thing. The rest of this is really about power and control, and how do we come up with systems to equitably distribute power and control and benefits and harms. So that would be one way to start, is just to stop talking about this always as if what we're consenting to is something that we have control over. We don't. The kind of consent that we're giving has really little in the way of power or control attached to it. It's the theater of power and control. Like, oh, I clicked that button, I had power over my finger. So, but it's just a dramaturgy. It's not real. I would say that on the commercial side, there are people who are thinking about how to parse out the informing and the consenting so that it's a little bit more digestible, and maybe there's a little bit like once you take an 8-page single space 8-point font document and split it up into something reasonable, if you're forced to go through that effort, then you'd also realize that there's actually steps in this process where people could consent to some but not all. And that would be a much more interesting way to do this. And then you've then united privacy, power, and control kind of into the same process, which I think is reasonable. I don't talk about this very much, but when I have talked about it with people like, say, venture capitalists, they're interested in that, which I don't know, given the way the world works, I guess is promising, but they are not pursuing it until there is stronger demand. Generally speaking, I find what IRBs do to be one of the better examples of how to do informed consent. Unfortunately, it usually doesn't really work at the large scale that most of these, or many interventions work at much larger scales, and you can't actually provide, it can't be available to talk to anyone who's in our system. We have millions of data subjects in our system, and we're a small company. So we do need, I would love to see a lot more work on that. That is one of the main areas of research and development that I'm interested in on that the commercial side. But yeah, so let's say we're not going to get there tomorrow. This is not going to somehow rise to the level of everyone's top research and development agenda. Then what? This is probably going to disappoint people, but what I do is, you try to put someone who's a very, an efficient dictator of tech ethics in place so that whatever decisions are being made are hopefully at least informed by ethics. I realize that that's sort of anti-democratic and objectionable on that level. But like I said, about 1% or less than 1% of what I do every day is ever going to involve an actual person coming to me and objecting to what we do. And I think that's probably pretty reasonable. How many of you have ever objected directly to Google? I don't know. If any of you sat on the task force that determined that NYU is going to move to Google, maybe you did object directly to Google, but we just don't.
Thank you.
Well, we all understand that.
Thank you.
Thanks for that. So I'd like to switch to Kyle.
Hi, Laura. Thank you for the very nice talk. I thought that what you were saying about the utilitarian approach to ethics was pretty interesting. And I was also, well, one thing that you gave this example of, say on several metrics, you're doing some sort of net good, but when you have your 1%, false positives, it's affecting some particular group. Then you said, then you haven't built an ethical system. And I don't disagree with that, but I was just thinking about the language is kind of like the system is ethical or it's not. And in some sense, there's this interesting interplay between what you know about and what you don't, and whether or not it's ethical or not. And I just, like, it seems like probably most systems are going to like say you just didn't know that, right? It's having this targeted effect on some community. You're not aware of it. So in that sense, it's not an ethical system, but you haven't really made a mistake in the sense that you're just totally blind to it. So I'm sure that this is all very naive I'm just not very well studied on, on ethics, but just curious if you could say a little bit about that. And then also if you think maybe that's connected a little bit to the kind of the tech people saying we should stop talking about it because we're doing like net good. It seems like it's very related, like, let me just put on the blinders. So it's not even about let's don't have an open conversation. It's like, as long as I don't know, I can still think of this as an ethical system. And if we explore that, I'm going to know it's not ethical, and then we have a problem. It seems like there's like a lot of a strong interplay between this utilitarian approach and this kind of desire to be blind to these problems.
Yeah, I think I said that you might have created a situation that is net beneficial, but is not fair on a fairness principle. So whether or not I'm not sure that I said it was unethical, the system, but it was not fair. So what would I recommend? I mean, to an order of an approximation, it's not like we live in a world where fairness has never been considered, and we really don't know like who might possibly be these groups that are disproportionately disadvantaged. We have social science, we kind of know what those typical groups are going to be. Not perfectly, not all the time, but it's usually not completely, like it's a little disingenuous to be like, I had no idea that, like, I don't know, Black people are sometimes more disadvantaged than white people. I mean, if you haven't figured that out in the US, you really have bigger problems. So to an order of approximation, you might just say, look, if you've designed some kind of social intervention, you might want to test the outcomes against social groups that have, historically been disadvantaged by many other social interventions that came before this one. Just look to see if your outcomes are disproportionately negative for those types of groups. Is it a huge surprise that working moms in academia are publishing less? Probably not. So should we be thinking about how our interventions are going to affect that particular group? Probably. So some of this stuff it's not like it takes, a PhD in social science to figure out where you want to look for differential impacts. So I would recommend do the standard race, class, gender template, and that'll get you probably, 80% of the way to where you need to be. And there's some other 20% that's going to be, more specific to whatever your intervention and ecosystem will be. So I'm speaking to a group of people who are trained in social science. So I'm curious what you do with these kinds of questions. I'm not the only expert in the room here.
So I guess in the interest of time, we'll probably have to end the call now. But thank you again so much for your great presentation. I really enjoyed it. And 2 weeks for everybody else on this call. In 2 weeks' time, we'll have our next PRISM seminar, and I hope to see some or all of you there. Thanks. And I'll just.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.